Where do we really come from? Well, it's probably the biggest question there is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely is.
For a long time, the story most of us heard centered on, a relatively recent expansion out of Africa.
Right, the standard narrative.
But what if that's only like one part of a much older, maybe much more tangled journey?
Well, our understanding is definitely shifting. New discoveries, genetics, archaeology, they keep challenging the older ideas,
Pushing back
pushing back dates, suggesting more complex movements, not just a simple one-way street out.
Exactly. And that's what we're really digging into today. We've got this stack of sources here.
Quite a stack.
Yeah, everything from this really detailed handbook on African Pleistocene archaeology to books and papers focusing on ancient DNA, population genetics, and some other texts that honestly offer some pretty different takes on human evolution.
So our mission really is to unpack all this. We want to pull out the key insights, the specific dates, especially those 70,000 years old or older, the regions involved.
And the different arguments, right? Particularly those that maybe question that simple out of Africa story.
Exactly. We're looking closely at perspectives and evidence that might suggest movement into sub-Saharan Africa from elsewhere.
Or ideas about where Homo sapiens might have originated or at least spent important evolutionary time, maybe outside sub-Saharan Africa.
Especially focusing on that evidence older than 70,000 years.
So think of this deep dive as your shortcut. We're trying to help you get your head around these competing ideas, the surprising evidence.
The stuff that's really shaking up the field right now, at least according to these sources we're looking at.
Right, let's jump in.
Okay, so setting the stage. Some of our sources do acknowledge what many consider the, let's call it, the traditional view.
That Africa played a central role.
Yeah, a central role in the origin of anatomically modern humans. They point to evidence like Homo sapiens skeletons found in Africa.
And those go back pretty far.
They do, up to around 300,000 years ago, in some cases mentioned.
And that traditional picture often includes the genetic story too, right? The dispersal out of Africa.
A major dispersal out of Africa and the Near East, generally placed within the last 50,000 years or so.
And lots of sources call this the Out of Africa Hypothesis. Oh.
Correct. But what's really fascinating in the materials we have today is how strongly some sources push back.
Against it being the only story.
Exactly. Especially when you look deeper in time. They're arguing the evidence supports much older movements and, crucially, maybe differently directed movements.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting then.
Yeah. So one source, from Ulfur Arnason, directly argues for something called an Out of Eurasia Hypothesis, OOEH.
Out of Eurasia.
Out of Eurasia. It basically flips the script.
How so?
It proposes that Homo, the broader genus, left Africa much earlier, maybe as Homo erectus,
Okay.
and then later returned to Africa, but as Homo sapiens, modern humans.
Wow. Okay, so returning to Africa, what's the evidence they use for that?
Well, this source relies heavily on genetic analysis, specifically phylogenetic analysis of mitochondrial DNA, that's the DNA passed down the maternal line.
Right.
They argue that when you trace these maternal lineages, African populations appear paraphyletic.
Paraphyletic. Okay, can you break that down a bit? What does that mean for, the listener trying to grasp this?
Sure. So basically, the source argues that this genetic pattern, if you imagine the human family tree based on this DNA, it doesn't look like a simple recent branching only within Africa, with one branch then leaving. Instead, Arneson interprets it as suggesting that some very old human lineages split off outside of the main African lines, developed elsewhere for a long time.
Developed in Eurasia in this model.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And then descendants of those groups moved back into Africa. So according to this source, that genetic structure makes the traditional Out of Africa hypothesis seem, well, incomplete for explaining the really deep past.
Okay, so that's the genetic argument. Does this source point to specific evidence for movement into sub-Saharan Africa based on this? And crucially, dates older than 70,000 years.
It does. It cites a specific event, a major Eurasian divergence among existing modern human populations that, according to their analysis, happened at the same time as what they describe as the exodus of Mbuti into Africa. Into Africa. Mbuti and San population. Into Africa, yes. And the date they give for this event is around 250,000 years before present.
Wow, 250,000 years ago. It's way older than the typical 50,000 year out of Africa time frame.
Exactly. So this source interprets genetic data as direct support for a significant migration into sub-Saharan Africa 250,000 years ago.
Okay, that's one pretty major challenge to the simple narrative. What else do the sources say?
Well, we also have a source from Robert Sepper that takes an even stronger position. This source describes the traditional Out of Africa hypothesis as, and these are the words used, a hoax or fraud.
That's a very strong language.
It is. This source argues that humanity is fundamentally a hybrid species.
Hybrid. Meaning?
Meaning our more recent history, say within the last 50,000 years primarily, involved a lot of interbreeding with various archaic hominin groups.
Like Neanderthals.
Neanderthals, Denisovans, and even, according to this source, an unknown mystery species or ghost species.
Okay, interesting. But how does that view support movement into sub-Saharan Africa?
Right. So the argument here is about Neanderthal DNA traces found in some sub-Saharan Africans. The standard view might explain that through complex ancient movements within Africa, or maybe very early out-and-back migrations. But this source claims something different. It argues those traces aren't from people leaving Africa and mixing. Instead, it claims that hybridized Europeans people who had already mixed with Neanderthals outside Africa later entered Africa.
After Africa and then
interbred with an archaic ghost species that was supposedly already present within Africa.
I see. So Neanderthal DNA arrives via people moving in.
That's the claim. And this source is very emphatic, stating there was absolutely and conclusively no out of Africa in the sense of sub-Saharan African people leaving Africa.
Okay, so while the specific event proposed here is more recent, maybe within 50K.
Yes, the interbreeding proposed is within that time frame.
The underlying idea strongly supports migration into Africa and challenges the traditional out-only model.
Correct. It's another perspective arguing for movement into the continent.
So across different sources, we're seeing this recurring theme. Significant human movement into Africa, not just out. We've got the Mbuti example, potentially 250,000 years ago from one perspective.
And the idea of later European groups entering from another. And there's more subtle support, too. Another source, Who We Are, mentions the possibility, just floats the idea that the lineage leading to modern humans might have sojourned in Eurasia.
Sojourned, like spent a significant amount of time there.
Yeah, for an important period before eventually returning to Africa. It also mentions back to Africa migrations in the context of North African ancestry, though some supporting evidence there is more recent than our 70K cutoff.
Okay, so this naturally leads to the next question. Where else might origins or key developments have happened according to these sources? Outside sub-Saharan Africa, and specifically looking at evidence older than, say, 70,000 years ago.
This is where the Out of Eurasia Hypothesis, the OOEH from Arneson, really focuses.
Right. They argue Eurasia was the donor.
Exactly. Donor, not the receiver, in HS's evolution, meaning key modern human developments happen there, not solely in Africa.
And what's the evidence cited for that, going back further than 70K?
Well, first, the source points to the long-established presence of Homo erectus across Eurasia. We know erectus left Africa very early and spread into Asia, Indonesia, Europe, establishing a hominin presence outside Africa for a vast period.
So the stage was set, evolutionarily speaking.
Precisely. Then, more specific to our lineage, the source cites some very deep genetic divergence dates calculated from modern and ancient genomes.
Okay, like what?
Like a divergence between early Homo sapiens and Homo antecessor, another early hominin found in Spain, happening in Eurasia around 850,000 years ago.
850,000?
Wow. And the split between our direct line, Homo sapiens, EHSS, and the Neanderthal Denisovan line, HSN, that's placed around 800,000 years before present, also argued to be centered around Eurasia in this model.
So these incredibly deep splits potentially happening outside Africa are key to the OOEH argument.
They are, and maybe even more striking is evidence cited for really ancient genetic mixing.
Mixing between who?
Between the HSNs, our ancestors, and Neanderthals, HSNN. The source points to evidence of mitochondrial DNA introgression.
Meaning mtDNA moving from one group to the other.
Yes, specifically from the modern human lineage into Neanderthals, around 500,000 years before present.
500,000 years ago. That implies they were interbreeding even, in Eurasia way, way back.
That's the implication presented in the source, yes. Long before the interbreeding events we usually talk about in the last 50,000 years.
Okay, that's the genetic and divergence angle. What about archaeology or fossils outside sub-Saharan Africa from that deep past?
Well, the sources bring up Jebel Irhoud in Morocco.
Right, Morocco, North Africa, outside sub-Saharan Africa.
Exactly. According to the Arneson source, the fossils there, which are identified as early Homo sapiens, were redated. And that redating pushed their age back significantly,
By how much?
by about 100,000 years, making them considerably older than 70,000 years. The exact date isn't given in the snippet we have, but the increase makes them highly relevant.
Relevant to the earliest phases of modern human evolution.
Yes, especially when considering those deep genetic splits we just talked about. Finding such old sapiens fossils outside sub-Saharan Africa fits into that broader OEH narrative, or at least complicates a purely sub-Saharan origin.
And sticking with Morocco, what about Contrabandier's cave? That's mentioned in the archaeology handbook.
Right, Contrabandiers has yielded Middle Stone Age material, MSA. That's the toolkit often associated with early modern humans.
And the dates there, are they old enough for our focus?
Oh, yes. The dates range across different layers, but they go from approximately 93,000 years ago in some layers up to about 126,000 years ago in the deepest ones we have dates for.
Okay, so clear evidence of MSA technology and human presence in North Africa well before 70,000 years ago.
Definitely. It shows significant early human activity and technological development in that region during this critical period.
And we should also loop back to the Robert Supper source here too, right? Because its whole argument is built on origins outside the traditional model.
Correct. While it focuses heavily on more recent hybridity within the last 50 kaya, its fundamental rejection of the standard Out of Africa model and emphasis on interbreeding with groups outside sub-Saharan Africa Neanderthals, Denisovans implicitly points to significant evolutionary events happening elsewhere. It even connects this to things like blood types, claiming Rh-negative blood type is linked to this hybridity.
Okay, so let's try and list these specific sites and dates clearly for the listener. We need 70,000 years old. Let's separate sub-Saharan Africa from outside sub-Saharan Africa, like Morocco.
Sounds good. So starting within sub-Saharan Africa.
What sites older than 70 kaya do the sources highlight?
Okay, Apollo 11 rock shelter in Namibia comes up. It has some very early Middle Stone Age dates, around 236,000 plus or minus 18,000 years ago, and 180,000 plus or minus 10,000 years ago.
Wow, really early MSA there.
Yes. And then later layers associated with the still bay industry date to around 80,000 years ago and 71,000 years ago, so spanning a huge time frame relevant to us.
Okay, where else in sub-Saharan Africa?
Northern Malawi, the Chitimwe Beds area. The oldest OSL date mentioned is 92,000 plus or minus 7,000 years ago, though most artifacts there are found in deposits dating to the last 75,000 years or so.
Still pushing back towards that 70K mark and beyond. What about East Africa, often seen as a key region?
Definitely. Kilombe volcano in Kenya is mentioned for MSA artifacts. It is Argon dates going way back, 250,000 years ago.
250,000 years ago, again.
And also later dates around 127,000 and 111,000 years ago.
And the Kapthuran Formation? Also Kenya?
Yes, Kapthuran Formation sites also yield MSA finds with similar date ranges. 270, 250,000 years ago, 127,000 years ago, and 111,000 years ago.
So undeniably, these sources show a very deep, complex history within sub-Saharan Africa too, long before 70,000 years ago.
Absolutely. Powerful evidence for long-term presence and development in situ in multiple regions of sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay, now shifting outside sub-Saharan Africa, specifically Morocco, based on our sources, for dates equals 70 Guerga, we mentioned Contrabandier's cave.
Right. And the dates there are numerous, from different layers and dating methods, but they consistently fall within our time frame. We see dates like 93,000 years ago, 95,000 years ago, ages around 104,000 and 110,000 years ago for certain sectors and layers, going back to 117,000 and 126,000 years ago.
A solid sequence showing MSA presence there between roughly 90 and 126,000 years ago.
Exactly. And then Jebel Irhoud, also Morocco. The Homo sapiens fossils themselves redated to be significantly older than 70,000 years.
Providing key fossil evidence from North Africa in this early period.
Precisely.
It's probably helpful to briefly touch on the even older stuff the sources mentioned, just for context, right? To show the timescale before Homo sapiens even enters the picture.
Good idea. The sources mention some really ancient hominins, like Sahelanthropus chidensis, way back around 7 million years ago. Though one source is skeptical, calling it an ape ancestor, maybe not bipedal.
And Ardipithecus remedis.
Ardi, around 4.4 million years ago, Ethiopia. Also mentioned, with one source even floating a really out-there idea that maybe apes evolved from us, not the other way around. A very fringe view presented.
Okay. And then Australopithecus, like Lucy, around 3.2 million years ago, clearly bipedal.
Right. And the earliest stone tools come up too. Older one tools, Gona, Ethiopia, 2.6, 2.5 million years ago. Maybe even older at Lamekwi 3 in Kenya, potentially 3.3 million years old.
Shows tool use goes incredibly far back.
It does. Then there's mention of the Acheulean technology, the hand axes. Sites like Kanso, Ethiopia, 1.75 million years ago. Buea in Eritrea, Colombe in Kenya, around 1 million years ago, often associated with Homo erectus, or ergaster.
And Homo erectus is key for some of these arguments, isn't it? The one described as leaving Africa early and spreading into Eurasia.
Yes, central to the OOEH idea of a long hominin presence outside Africa before sapiens. The sources also briefly mention Homo naledi in South Africa, a more recent discovery adding complexity within Africa.
And circling back to the mixing aspect, the interbreeding, the sources keep highlighting this.
They do. Neanderthals, Denisovans, the mystery species from the separate source, these interactions are presented as important parts of the human story.
Mostly within the last 50K years for the widely accepted mixing events.
Mostly, yes. But remember that Arneson's source, citing potential mtDNA integration into Neanderthals way back around 500,000 years ago, and the divergent states themselves, 850 kaya, implied long periods of separation before any later mixing.
Right, and the sources also mentioned ghost populations.
Yeah, that's a concept from genetics. Populations whose existence is inferred from patterns in the DNA of living people or ancient samples, but we haven't found their fossils yet. And these have been detected relating to Africa, too.
Adding yet another layer of unknown complexity.
Definitely.
Okay, so let's pull back and try to answer that core question, based only on these specific sources we've reviewed. Did Homo sapiens have a sub-Saharan East African origin, excluding Morocco?
What the sources show together is, it's not a simple yes or no answer. It's really a mixed picture.
How so?
On one hand, you have materials that clearly acknowledge Africa's central importance. They point to those early sapiens fossils found within the continent, like in Ethiopia or potentially South Africa, going back hundreds of thousands of years.
And the genetic evidence for the dispersal out of Africa in the last 50,000 years is also noted.
Absolutely. That's part of the picture presented.
Right.
But crucially, several sources actively challenge this being the only origin point or the complete story.
Right, like the OOEH perspective.
Exactly. The OOEH source, Arneson, explicitly argues for Eurasia as the donor, placing key evolutionary events and divergences there. And it provides that specific interpretation of genetic data suggesting migration into Africa, the Mbuti and Exodus around 250,000 years ago.
And the Sepper source, arguing for hybridized Europeans entering Africa later.
Right, and the Who We Are source, floating the idea of a Eurasian sojourn before a return. These all complicate a simple, single origin in sub-Saharan Africa.
And what about the archaeology? Those sites older than 7DQ.
Well, the sites within sub-Saharan Africa, Colombe, Kapthuran in East Africa, Apollo 11 in Southern Africa, Chitimwe beds in Malawi, they clearly demonstrate a very deep presence. Modern humans or closely related groups using MSA tech were definitely thriving there long ago.
So a long history in sub-Saharan Africa is undeniable based on these sources.
Undeniable. It shows deep roots within the continent.
However, when we look at the evidence 7DQ presented for regions outside sub-Saharan Africa,
that's where it gets really interesting for the origin question. You have the contrabandiers' dates in Morocco, the redated Jebel Irhoud fossils, also in Morocco.
Both North Africa.
Yes. And then you have the much deeper genetic and paleontological arguments from the OOEH source pointing to Eurasia. Those divergence dates over 800,000 years ago, the claimed introgression 500,000 years ago, and that interpreted Mbuti migration into Africa 250,000 years ago.
So do these sources taken together offer support that might favor origins outside sub-Saharan Africa older than 50,000 years ago?
I'd say some sources, particularly Arneson's OOEH framework, explicitly do. They present interpretations of evidence that place key evolutionary splits and potentially the emergence of the HSS lineage itself, or significant parts of its early history outside sub-Saharan Africa, well before 50K.
And the evidence from Morocco 7DQ also points to significant early sapiens presence and activity outside the sub-Saharan region.
Correct. So, while sub-Saharan Africa clearly has a tremendously deep history based on these sources, materials like the OOEH source and the North African findings actively challenge the idea that it was the sole or exclusive point of origin, suggesting a potentially more significant role for Eurasia or North Africa in that deeper time frame, Ixil 70 Kia or even 50 Kia.
Okay, let's try to synthesize this for you, the listener. What really jumps out from digging into this stack of sources is, well, just how complex and debated the story of our origins actually is.
Yeah, it's definitely not a single settled narrative that emerges from these materials. Not at all.
We see really different scientific interpretations, people looking at the same kinds of evidence, fossils, genetics, and coming up with competing hypotheses.
Like the standard Out of Africa model versus this Out of Eurasia hypothesis. The sources present compelling arguments. using different pieces of data pointing in potentially different directions.
And they really highlight things like ancient interbreeding between different groups across continents.
And complex migrations that seem to have involved movement into Africa, not just out. And this is potentially happening over hundreds of thousands of years.
Looking specifically at that 70,000-year mark and older, the sources give us evidence for modern humans, or very closely related groups, and their cultures being present in both sub-Saharan Africa.
Like East and Southern Africa.
And in regions outside it, like Morocco, with broader arguments also pointing towards Eurasia's potential role.
So hopefully this deep dive gives you a kind of shortcut. You get a sense of these varied, sometimes contradictory viewpoints.
And the specific evidence, the dates, the locations, the genetic findings that researchers, at least in these sources, are really grappling with.
Yeah, it helps you feel a bit more informed about a field that's clearly evolving really fast.
So the big takeaway, the story of human origins, filtered through these particular sources, is far from a closed book.
Definitely not. We see compelling evidence presented for ancient populations, really complex migration patterns, lots of interbreeding, including explicit arguments and evidence supporting movement into Africa at very deep dates.
Which leaves us with maybe a final thought for you to chew on. If the evidence presented here genetics, fossils suggest our past involved this complex mix, movements potentially both out of and back into Africa over vast timescales. And if our basic understanding of who these early hominins were, what they could do, how they're related, if that's still being actively debated and revised with every new find,
Which clearly is.
then how might all this fundamentally change how we think about ourselves, about human diversity, our shared, incredibly deep past?
It's a profound question. What discoveries are still out there, waiting to completely rewrite parts of this already complex story?